The dead do not buy strawberries on a Tuesday afternoon. That was the first thought that entered my mind when I saw my husband standing under the fluorescent lights of Kroger 6 months after I buried him. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 67 years old, and until yesterday, I believed I was a widow. I remember every detail of Thomas's funeral because grief brands moments into your memory like fire into wood. The cold rain soaking through my black wool coat. The muddy cemetery grass sticking to my heels. My son Daniel wrapping his arm around my shoulders while I cried into a tissue that smelled faintly of lavender lotion. I remember watching workers lower the casket into the earth while the pastor said Thomas had been a loyal husband, a devoted father, a good Christian man. I believed every word. God help me, I believed all of it. Yesterday morning, I drove to the grocery store because I ran out of coffee creamer and oranges. That was all. A completely ordinary Tuesday in Akron, Ohio. I was standing near the produce section comparing 2 cartons of strawberries when I heard a laugh behind me. Not just any laugh. His laugh. Thomas always laughed softly, through his nose first before making any sound. 42 years of marriage trains your body to recognize tiny things before your mind catches up. My fingers tightened around the shopping cart handle so hard my knuckles turned white. Slowly, I turned my head, and there he was, my husband, alive, wearing the same brown leather jacket he used to wear every fall, his silver wedding ring still resting on his left hand as he picked through tomatoes like a man with absolutely nothing to hide. For one terrible second, I thought maybe grief had finally broken my mind, but then Thomas glanced over his shoulder nervously, like a man terrified of being recognized, and walked quickly toward checkout lane 6. I did not call his name. That is the part that still surprises me when I think back on it now. After 42 years of marriage, after sharing a bed with that man, raising a son with him, sitting beside him through surgeries and layoffs and funerals and anniversaries, you would think my first instinct would have been to run to him. But something colder took hold of me in that moment. Something careful. Thomas moved through the checkout line with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. He avoided eye contact with everyone around him. His baseball cap was pulled low, and every few seconds his eyes flicked toward the front windows like he expected trouble to come walking through the automatic doors. I stayed 3 aisles behind him pretending to study canned soup while my heart beat so hard it made my chest ache. When he paid, he used cash. That detail lodged itself deep inside my mind because Thomas never carried cash. In 40 years, that man paid for everything with the same navy blue Visa card he kept tucked behind his driver's license. I watched him push the cart into the parking lot beneath a gray October sky while cold wind scattered leaves across the pavement. He loaded groceries into a dark blue SUV with temporary plates, not the silver Ford Explorer he supposedly died owning. Then he drove away. I followed him. My hands trembled on the steering wheel so badly, I nearly missed a red light near Maple Avenue. Part of me kept praying there was some explanation. A twin brother I never knew about. Some terrible misunderstanding. Anything. But 20 minutes later, Thomas pulled into the driveway of a pale yellow house in a quiet neighborhood outside Canton. And then the front door opened. A little girl with curly brown hair ran down the porch steps screaming, "Daddy is home," before throwing her arms around my husband like she had done it 1,000 times before. The little girl could not have been older than 6. She wore pink rain boots and clung to Thomas's leg while he smiled down at her with the same soft expression he used to give our son Daniel when he was small. That smile nearly destroyed me more than anything else because it was real.
Warm. Familiar.
Loving. Not the face of a man being forced into hiding. Not the face of a man trapped against his will. The front door opened wider, and a woman stepped outside holding a dish towel in one hand. She looked younger than me by at least 15 years, with dark blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail and the relaxed posture of someone completely comfortable in her own home. She leaned over and kissed Thomas lightly on the cheek before taking one of the grocery bags from his arms. Domestic.
Casual. Ordinary.
Like they had repeated this exact routine every Tuesday for years. I sat frozen across the street inside my Buick while the heater hummed softly against the cold October air. My fingers had gone numb around the steering wheel. Then the woman laughed and said something I could not hear clearly through the closed windows, but I saw Thomas laugh back. My husband. The man whose funeral guests hugged me over while whispering how strong I had been. The man I spent 6 months grieving so deeply that some mornings I could barely force myself out of bed. The porch light flickered on as the little girl grabbed his hand and pulled him inside the house. Before the door closed, I caught one final detail that made my stomach twist painfully. Hanging beside the entryway was a framed family photo. Thomas stood in the center with his arm around that little girl and the younger woman smiling beside him like they belonged together. Like I had never existed at all. I drove home in silence with my chest so tight I could hardly breathe. But sometime around midnight, after staring at the ceiling for hours, one thought began clawing through my mind louder than all the others. If Thomas lied about dying, then somebody helped him do it. At 2:17 in the morning, I climbed out of bed, wrapped my cardigan tightly around my shoulders, and pulled the storage box labeled Thomas documents from the back of my bedroom closet. My hands shook so badly that one of the folders slipped onto the floor beside my slippers. For 6 months, I had avoided opening that box because grief has a strange way of turning paper into pain. Every receipt, every sympathy card, every hospital form felt too heavy to touch. But now the silence inside my house felt different. Not lonely.
Deceptive.
I carried the box to the kitchen table and switched on the small lamp beside the refrigerator. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while the old clock above the stove ticked loud enough to make me uneasy. I started with the funeral paperwork. Closed casket requested by immediate family. That line stopped me cold because I suddenly remembered how quickly Daniel insisted on it. He told me the hospital said Thomas's condition had deteriorated badly after the heart attack. He said it would be better for me not to see him that way. At the time, I thought he was protecting me. Now, I wondered who he had really been protecting. I kept reading. Cremation authorization. Insurance claim forms. Hospital transfer documents. Every page carried Daniel's handwriting in the margins because he handled almost everything after the funeral. Back then, I was too numb to question it. Then, I found the bank statement. A transfer of $48,000 from one of our joint retirement accounts 3 days after Thomas supposedly died. I stared at the date for nearly a full minute before checking again because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Thomas always handled our finances carefully. He balanced every account down to the penny every Sunday afternoon after church. And yet somehow, money had moved after his death. My throat tightened painfully as another memory surfaced. The morning after the funeral, Rebecca hugged me in my kitchen and quietly asked if I had considered downsizing the house now that I was alone. By sunrise, my kitchen table looked like the office of someone preparing for a trial instead of a grieving widow trying to survive another lonely morning. Papers covered every inch of the wood surface. Insurance forms, hospital invoices, funeral receipts, copies of signatures I had never bothered to study before because I trusted my family more than I trusted my own instincts. That trust now felt humiliating. Around 7:30, my phone rang. Daniel. I stared at his name glowing on the screen while cold coffee sat untouched beside me. For a moment, I almost answered normally. Almost asked how work was going. Almost pretended my entire world had not split open less than 12 hours earlier. But then I remembered him standing beside me at the cemetery wearing a black tie and wiping fake tears from his eyes while his father was apparently still breathing somewhere in Ohio. I let the call go to voicemail. His voice sounded cheerful, casual. Morning, Mom. Rebecca and I were thinking maybe we could stop by tonight and help you organize some boxes in the garage. You have too much stuff in that big house alone. Too much stuff. The same phrase Rebecca had used 3 separate times since the funeral. I suddenly remembered all the little comments I ignored while drowning in grief. Suggestions about selling the house. Questions about life insurance paperwork. Daniel insisting I add his name to one of my accounts, just in case something happened. At the time, I thought they were worried about me. Now, every conversation sounded rehearsed, carefully placed. Like people slowly guiding an old woman toward a decision she never wanted to make. I spent the afternoon rereading the hospital records, and one detail finally caught my attention hard enough to stop my breathing for a second. The attending physician listed on Thomas's death certificate was someone I had never met. Not once during his supposed hospital stay had I heard that doctor's name. Yet, according to the paperwork, that stranger signed the document declaring my husband officially dead. The next morning, I drove to St. Andrew Medical Center with dark circles under my eyes and a folder full of copies resting on the passenger seat beside me. The sky hung low and gray over Akron, and cold drizzle blurred the windshield while I kept rehearsing the same question in my head over and over again. Can you confirm this doctor worked here 6 months ago? That was all I needed. One answer. One small piece of truth in a mountain of lies. The woman at the records desk wore bright purple glasses and smelled faintly of peppermint gum. She typed the physician's name into her computer, while I stood there gripping my purse strap tightly enough to leave marks in my palm. Then her forehead wrinkled slightly. I am sorry, she said politely. There has never been a Dr. Raymond Pike employed at this hospital. For a second, I genuinely thought I might faint right there beside the waiting room magazines and hand sanitizer station. I asked her to check. Again. Slowly this time.
She did.
Same answer. No doctor by that name. My knees felt weak as I thanked her and walked back toward the parking garage. Every sound around me suddenly felt distant. Rolling wheelchairs. Elevator bells. Nurses calling patient names. I sat inside my Buick for almost 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel while rain tapped softly against the roof. Then another memory surfaced so sharply it made my stomach twist. The night Thomas supposedly died, Daniel never let me stay at the hospital very long. He kept insisting I go home and rest while he handled everything. Rebecca brought me tea. Daniel drove me back to the house. Daniel signed papers. Daniel spoke to funeral directors. Daniel even picked out the framed photograph displayed beside the casket at the memorial service. My son had controlled every single detail from the moment Thomas was declared dead. And for the first time in my life, I became afraid that I did not really know my own child at all. That evening, Daniel and Rebecca arrived at my house carrying takeout containers from Olive Garden and wearing the careful smiles people use when they are trying to appear loving. I opened the front door and forced myself to smile back. It shocked me how easily I could still play the role of grieving widow after what I had seen. Rebecca hugged me first. Her perfume smelled sweet and expensive, and for one strange second I remembered helping her choose centerpieces for her wedding 12 years ago. I used to think she was ambitious. Now I wondered if she had simply always been calculating. Daniel kissed my forehead and asked if I had been sleeping any better lately. That question nearly broke something inside me because his voice sounded so sincere. We sat in the kitchen eating lukewarm pasta while rain slid slowly down the windows behind them. Daniel talked about work. Rebecca talked about rising grocery prices. Ordinary conversation. Ordinary people. Meanwhile, all I could see was my supposedly dead husband laughing inside another woman's house while my son helped maintain the lie. At one point, Rebecca glanced toward the hallway and casually said, "You know, Margaret, this house is probably too much responsibility for one person now. Maybe it would feel healthier to start fresh somewhere smaller." There it was again. Soft pressure wrapped in concern. Daniel nodded immediately. "We worry about you being alone here, Mom. Especially at your age." At your age. I lowered my fork carefully onto the plate because suddenly I understood something horrifying. They were not comforting me after a tragedy. They were managing me, guiding me, keeping me emotionally weak enough not to question anything. Then Daniel stood to help clear dishes, and his phone lit up on the counter beside me. The message preview appeared for only a second before the screen darkened again, but one sentence burned itself permanently into my mind. "She still believes everything. We just need a little more time." The message was from a contact saved only under the letter T. That message changed something inside me permanently. Until then, a small part of my heart had still been searching for excuses. Maybe Daniel had been manipulated. Maybe Thomas lied to everyone. Maybe there was some complicated explanation hiding underneath all this betrayal. But those 8 words erased every comforting possibility I had left. She still believes everything. Not Mom. Not Margaret.
She.
Like I was no longer a person to them. Just a problem being managed until they could finish whatever plan they had started. I barely slept that night. Around 4 a.m, I sat alone on my back porch wrapped in a blanket while freezing wind moved through the maple trees in my yard. This house suddenly felt different too. Not warm anymore. Not safe. Every room carried memories that now felt contaminated. The dining room where Thomas carved Thanksgiving turkey for 20 years. The living room where Daniel opened Christmas presents beside the fireplace when he was little. Had they both been lying to me for months?
Years?
I kept replaying small moments that once seemed harmless. Thomas becoming strangely protective of his phone during the last 2 years before his death. Daniel quietly asking detailed questions about my retirement savings after the funeral. Rebecca insisting she knew a realtor who specialized in helping widows downsize quickly. One memory hit me harder than all the others combined. 3 weeks before Thomas supposedly died, I overheard him arguing with Daniel in the garage late at night. Their voices were low, tense. I could not hear every word, but I clearly remember Thomas saying, "Your mother can never find out until everything is finalized." At the time, I assumed they were discussing finances or taxes. Now those words sounded like a confession echoing backward through time. By sunrise, I made a decision I never imagined making against my own family. I called Harold Bennett. Harold had been our attorney for nearly 20 years, and more importantly, he was one of the few people Thomas never fully trusted, which suddenly made me trust him even more. Harold Bennett answered on the third ring with the same calm voice I remembered from years of legal paperwork and neighborhood charity dinners. "Margaret," he said gently, "I was actually thinking about calling you this week. How are you holding up?" That question almost made me cry because for the first time in days, someone sounded genuinely concerned instead of carefully rehearsed. I told him I needed to see him in person and asked if we could meet somewhere private. An hour later, I sat across from him inside his downtown Canton office while pale morning sunlight stretched across shelves filled with thick law books and framed certificates. Harold listened without interrupting while I explained everything. The grocery store. The yellow house. The little girl calling Thomas Daddy. Daniel's text message. The fake doctor. I expected disbelief. Instead, Harold's expression slowly hardened into something colder. When I finally finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and stayed silent for several long seconds before saying something that made my stomach drop. "Margaret, there is something I never told you, because Thomas specifically instructed me not to." My chest tightened instantly. Harold opened a locked drawer in his desk and removed a thin manila folder with Thomas's name written across the tab. About a year before his death, Harold continued carefully. Thomas came to me, asking questions about asset protection, identity changes, and transferring property ownership through indirect beneficiaries. I stared at him without breathing. Harold slid several photocopies across the desk toward me.
Wire transfers.
Property documents. Financial records connected to a limited liability company registered under another name. The address listed on one of the papers was the same yellow house I had followed Thomas to 3 nights earlier. My fingers trembled as I turned another page and saw the final date printed near the bottom. The property had been purchased 8 months before Thomas supposedly died, which meant my husband had been building a second life long before he was ever buried. For a long moment, I could not speak. I simply sat there staring at the paperwork while a deep exhaustion settled into my bones. Not shock anymore. Something heavier. The kind of heartbreak that arrives when confusion finally hardens into truth. Harold quietly slid a box of tissues across his desk, but I did not take one. I had cried enough over Thomas Collins. "There is more," Harold said carefully. He opened another folder and removed copies of insurance documents connected to Thomas's life insurance policy. The payout had already been distributed less than 2 weeks after the funeral. 70% transferred into a trust connected to Daniel. The remaining amount routed through the limited liability company tied to the yellow house. My throat tightened painfully. "So my son was paid," I whispered. Harold did not answer immediately, and that silence told me everything. I leaned back slowly in the leather chair and stared out the office window at people walking below on Market Avenue carrying coffee cups and shopping bags, living ordinary lives untouched by this kind of betrayal. Then another memory surfaced with brutal clarity. 2 months after the funeral, Daniel suddenly paid off his truck loan. Rebecca started wearing designer handbags she previously could not afford. They told me Daniel had received a promotion at work. I believed them, because mothers are trained to believe their children even when logic begs them not to. Harold finally spoke again, his voice lower now. Margaret, I also hired a private investigator yesterday after hearing your story. He confirmed Thomas has been using the name Martin Cole for nearly 6 months. 6 months. The exact amount of time I had spent sleeping alone beside an empty half of the bed while my husband played dead and built another life 30 miles away. I folded my hands carefully in my lap because I could feel anger beginning to rise beneath my skin for the first time since this nightmare started. Not loud anger. Not explosive anger. Something colder. More focused. Thomas and Daniel believed grief had weakened me. What they did not understand was that grief also teaches people how to survive unbearable things quietly. Over the next week, I became someone I barely recognized. I smiled when Daniel called. I thanked Rebecca for checking on me. I even invited them over for Sunday dinner and listened quietly while they discussed kitchen renovations they clearly could not have afforded a few months earlier. The strangest part was realizing how easy it became to notice their lies once I stopped trusting them. Daniel suddenly avoided looking directly into my eyes whenever Thomas came up in conversation. Rebecca overexplained everything. Every compliment sounded rehearsed. Every act of kindness felt measured. Meanwhile, Harold's investigator continued gathering information. By Thursday afternoon, we knew the younger woman's name was Melissa Grant. 43 years old. Elementary school secretary.
Divorced.
According to public records, she had been living in the Yellow House for almost 3 years, which meant Thomas had not stumbled into another relationship after disappearing. He had been building a second family while still sleeping beside me every night. That realization hurt more deeply than the fake funeral, more deeply than the stolen money. Because betrayal becomes unbearable when you realize it was happening while you were still loving someone honestly. Harold also uncovered something else. Daniel had accumulated nearly $90,000 in gambling debt over the last 2 years through online sports betting accounts. Suddenly, everything made horrible sense. The pressure to sell my house. The urgency around the insurance payout. The emotional manipulation after the funeral. They were not simply trying to escape into a new life. They needed money. And I had unknowingly become the easiest person to sacrifice. Late Friday evening, I sat alone in my living room holding an old framed photograph from our 25th wedding anniversary. Thomas had his arm around my waist. Daniel stood smiling between us in a blue graduation sweater. We looked like a happy family. Real. Solid. Safe. I stared at that picture for a long time before finally understanding something painful. The people inside that frame no longer existed. Maybe they never truly had. The following Sunday, I invited Daniel and Rebecca to dinner again. I cooked pot roast with carrots the same way I had every winter since Daniel was a boy, because I wanted the evening to feel familiar, comfortable, safe. By then, Harold had already contacted federal investigators quietly through one of his former colleagues, and every financial record connected to Thomas's fake death was being reviewed. But nobody at my dining table knew that yet. Rebecca arrived carrying a bottle of wine and complimented the smell of the food the moment she stepped inside. Daniel kissed my cheek and asked if I had been feeling less lonely lately. I looked at my son standing there in my hallway wearing the wristwatch Thomas gave him at college graduation, and for one painful second, I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after nightmares. Then the memory disappeared, replaced by the man who helped bury an empty casket while I cried beside it. During dinner, Rebecca casually brought up real estate again. "There is a beautiful retirement community outside Dayton," she said while cutting her pot roast into tiny pieces. "They have walking trails, security, gardening clubs. It could really simplify your life." Simplify your life. Such gentle words for removing someone from their own home. Daniel nodded immediately and added that maintaining a 4-bedroom house alone must be exhausting at my age. At my age. I noticed they used that phrase often now, as though repeating it enough times would slowly convince me I was fragile. I smiled softly and told them maybe they were right. The relief that flashed across Rebecca's face lasted less than a second, but I caught it. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand warmly. We just want what is best for you, Mom. I almost admired how naturally the lies came to him now. Then my phone buzzed quietly beside my plate. A message from Harold. 3 words only. He took the bait. I folded my napkin carefully into my lap and smiled at my family while something cold and steady settled inside my chest. 3 days later, I invited Daniel and Rebecca over one final time. I told them I had made a decision about the house and wanted to discuss paperwork before contacting a realtor. Rebecca arrived almost breathless with excitement hidden beneath fake concern, and Daniel kept trying to act calm while glancing around my living room like he was already imagining the place empty. I served coffee in the good china cups I used only for holidays and funerals. Strange how this evening felt like both. Rebecca sat forward eagerly and asked whether I had chosen the retirement community near Dayton they recommended. I told her I was still considering my options. Then I reached beneath the coffee table and placed a thick manila folder directly in front of Daniel. The color drained from his face almost immediately when he saw the words Federal Insurance Investigation stamped across the top. Neither of them touched the folder. The room became so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Harold says the investigators already know about the false death certificate, I said calmly. They also know Thomas has been living under another name. Rebecca's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Daniel stared at me like he was suddenly seeing a stranger instead of his mother. I kept my voice steady, because by then anger no longer controlled me. Clarity did. The yellow house in Canton was a poor choice. I continued softly. Following your father there turned out to be very easy. Daniel finally whispered, Mom, please let me explain. Explain. Such a small word for destroying someone's entire life from the inside out. I looked at my son for a long moment and realized something unexpected. I was no longer heartbroken. Heartbreak requires love mixed with pain. What I felt now was distance. Cold, clean distance. Then the front doorbell rang. Rebecca flinched so hard she nearly dropped her coffee cup. I stood slowly and smoothed the wrinkles from my sweater before walking toward the door. That, I said quietly, will probably be the investigators arriving to speak with both of you.